The meeting, ag meeting for February 16th is called to order. Roll call, please.
Representative Allemand,
Present.
Representative Allred,
Here.
Representative Banks,
Here.
Representative Conrad,
Here.
Representative Crago,
Here.
Representative Davis,
Here.
Representative Slagle,
Present.
Representative Winter,
Here.
Chairman Eklund.
Here.
Thank you.
First bill for our consideration is Senate File 137. Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, this was the works of you'll see there's a different number of sponsors on here, but Mr. Chairman, this was a joint interim topic by the Ag Committee that they worked on. The difference between what the joint committee did and what Senate File 137 did is this. The Senate had just moved this. Originally, that bill was in the lawful fencing standards for the state of Wyoming, and what we did was move it into the subdivision standards where it's all about subdivisions, and it was much more probably appropriate to put it in that section than it was. It was a little bit of a stretch to put it into the lawful fencing standards, so it just seemed to be a lot more logical fit because it specifically dealt with subdivisions. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll just walk you through the bill real quick. No substantive changes from the original joint interim bill. But this just goes into the subdivision section of state statutes. Pretty much all of page 2, deals with perimeter fences around subdivisions. That's all the bill deals with, Mr. Chairman. So if you get over to page 2 on line 17 and you start with there, this just comes right out of the lawful fence standards section of the law. Says this is what constitutes a lawful fence. It's just existing statutes, and now we've moved that into the subdivision section. And then all of that carries over into page 4, and then all the way over to page 5. Then it just has a provision in here, Mr. Chairman. The subdivider, when they do their normal, so when you go through a subdivision plat, you submit that to the county for review as a normal subdivision. It just says you'll include any perimeter fencing in that subdivision review to the county, and that's what you see on page 5, subsection D. Mr. Chairman, then we go into 18.506, which is the minimum requirements for a subdivision. And that just brings in the requirement for the fence. You get over to the new subsection on page 6. It just says those plans shall be provided for the construction of that fence, including the type of perimeter fence, the materials to be used in the subdivider's plan, and paying for the cost of the perimeter fence. So, Mr. Chairman, this just requires, as part of a subdivision, that you have to meet the lawful fence standards. You have to provide a copy with your subdivision plan to the county to review that, and then the subdivider is responsible for 100% of the cost of construction. Mr. Chairman, that's what the bill does. I'd stand for any questions.
Questions, committee. Representative Allemand.
Senator Hicks, on page 2, line 18, where it talks about wooden posts and 3 barbed wires. What if the rancher has sheep? That will not keep them out of the subdivision. And that's my only concern.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Allemand, this just brought in what the minimum lawful fence standards are for the state of Wyoming. And so back to your issue, if you did have a case like that, that's probably going to come back. Anything above and beyond the minimum lawful fence standards most likely would be negotiated with that landowner, AKA the sheep rancher, on the other side of any additional cost associated with the fence. This just says that you have a duty for the minimum requirements at 100% of your cost as a subdivider. It really didn't get into contemplating that, but normal situation would then be a negotiated arrangement between the landowner and even if it was another neighbor building a fence. And then you go all the way, that goes all the way back into the fencing standards and who's liable and a fence out state and all of that stuff starts to come into play in a different section of statutes. Mr. Chairman, at least that's my story this morning and I'm gonna stick to it.
Okay. Representative Conrad. I see.
Chairman Eklund, thank you. Senator Hicks, just a quick question, and I don't want to assume which generally gets me in trouble. Has this been an issue that's arising based on more subdividing going on in the state and the lack thereof of properly fencing off and putting the cost back on the respective ranch owner?
Mr. Chairman, you'd probably be better to answer that question, given that this was an interim ag committee bill. I know that's part of the consideration, but I would be reluctant to speak for the joint ag committee that worked this bill through the interim. Would probably, Mr. Chairman, be better at answering that question than I am.
Yes, so it is an issue and becoming more and more of an issue. It's been brought to the Ag Committee. It's a difficult deal to fix because the regular fencing laws oftentimes don't address what's going on with subdivisions. And this doesn't necessarily address it all either. And we're seeing more and more land within ranches that's been leased, selling, and finding an equitable way to share the fence costs. It seems that it's probably going to stay the way it was. Each side pays for half of a lawful fence. So we didn't fix many of the concerns addressed because of fence law and the way it's written. I guess a question I have on the bill that Senator Hicks may be able to answer is maintenance of the fence after it's built.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I know that was quite a discussion, and I can't remember where we ended up with that in the bill. So you have to understand the nature of a subdivision is somebody subdivides a piece of land and then they sell the parcels. So at that point in time, you can't make the subdivider responsible for maintaining a fence on somebody else's property. So I think what we attempted to do is saying that once those lands are transferred to a new owner, that they're responsible for that maintenance, Mr. Chairman. And I'm trying to find out where that is in the bill.
Yeah, we found it.
All right. So I hope that answers the question.
Sure. Any other questions? Thank you. Any questions from the, or comments from the public? Mr. Moline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, sitting firmly in favor of this bill. This is good for the ag operators. Part of the impetus behind this bill was that, the way the statute is currently is that the ag operator would have to pay for half the fence. Designed to keep the animals where they were supposed to be. Part of that with the subdivision, sometimes they want a fence that is substantially more than what we as ag producers need to keep our animals at home. A big, beautiful 10-foot high concrete fence, well, that's fine. Where we only had to pay for half of a normal fence, but what this does is it puts the burden on the developer. When that land is subdivided, they not only have to build it, but they have to maintain it too. I think that's a fantastic idea because, as you folks probably know, a lot of times, fence looks pretty good for 10, 20 years. Well, then after 50 years, when it's starting to fall apart, well, the landowner, the agricultural operation, should this bill go forward, won't have to pay for the cost of reconstructing or maintaining that fence. So Mr. Chairman, sitting firmly in favor of this bill. And with that, I would sit for any questions you or the committee may have.
Okay, well, thank you. Any other public comment? No one online? Okay, we'll close public comment. Committee, what's your pleasure? Been moved by Conrad, seconded by Slagle. Discussion on the bill? It's like we're ready to vote.
Representative Alderman,
Aye.
Representative Allred,
Aye.
Representative Banks,
Aye.
Representative Conrad,
Aye.
Representative Craigo,
Aye.
Representative Davis,
Aye.
Representative Slagle,
Aye.
Representative Winter.
Aye.
Chairman Eklund,
Aye.
9 ayes, no nos, bill pass.
Okay, next bill for our consideration is Senate File 107. And I think we've got two presenters here that, Cyrus, if you want to come up as well.
I
And
want
we'll
to
have,
bring all my friends, Mr. Chairman.
you bet. Yeah, eventually we'll have everybody up here anyway, so. Welcome to our meeting.
Mr. Chairman, so I bring you Senate File 107, Acquisition, Exchange, and Sales of Trust Land. So what the bill contemplates is there's really three provisions in here. And as I walk through the bill, I'll explain those. But the first one is this codification of an existing policy that's been in place since 1999 as far as maintaining a portfolio of state trust lands. The second component of that is it does provide some loan mechanism for landowners to access through the state of Wyoming if they chose to do so. And then it specifically calls out 80-acre parcels or less, and particularly those ones that are isolated that have no public access. Mr. Chairman, really the purpose of the bill, when we get to the second half, I've given you a handout, and if you'll just take a look at that. So this is focused on those parcels of state trust lands that are 80 acres or less. And so when you look at that map, that's where they're located around the state. And if you look in the right-hand corner, there's a total of 2,149 parcels of state lands that are 80 acres or less, for a total of a little over 109,000 acres that's scattered, isolated parcels around the state. And so what the bill contemplates is allowing for the sale of these, and particularly with an emphasis on those ones that we could call out at a definition of isolated and without public access. And the idea is to make state lands more manageable by selling off those little parcels or exchanging them. That's the other option you could do. And then accumulate enough of those that then you could acquire another parcel of land to offset that. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll just walk you through the bill. So we start out, we bring in a new section of law, which is 36-111 is created. And Mr. Chairman, if you flip over to page 2, this codifies the existing policy that's been in place since 1999. And so what it just says, when determined by the board consistent with the duties, that they have the ability to sell these lands. So the first component of the bill deals with under subsection A, is the acquire, exchange, sell fee title interest in these state lands. And again, keep in mind, this bill is specifically focused. They can do this already, but what we're trying to do is draw an emphasis on these isolated 80-acre smaller parcels that are sitting out there that have no public access to them. You could still go ahead. This just brings in that existing policy that allows them to acquire, exchange, or sell for fee title interest. So subsection B would allow the Office of State Land, once they do that, then they can go purchase other lands to offset that. So the background on that, Mr. Chairman, under subsection A and subsection B, this has been the policy since 1999. It's not in statute, it's just a policy. The derivation of that policy was, as through the 90s, we were seeing a lot of state lands being put up for nomination and sold. And it kind of became a big interest to the public, the rate of the amount of state lands that we were selling. So at that point in time, there was a lot of controversy associated with just selling off all the school sections primarily. So the board went through a number of public meetings and quite a process and come up with a policy that says, look, we're gonna try to maintain a portfolio of plus or minus 10,000 acres. In other words, kind of a no net loss of state lands. That's what this two sections goes in and codifies what that policy's been in 1999. If we dispose of a lot of land, that at some point in time when we get to that 10,000 acres of sales, we got to go back and replace that to try to keep it within that plus or minus 10,000 acres. Mr. Chairman, so that's what that section does, is codify the existing policy. So then if we go over to subsection, or Mr. Chairman, not subsection, I'm trying to work off both my notes from the bill and the engrossed bill. So when we go to
Senator
page-
Hicks,
Yep.
I've got a question before
Yep,
we move on. I had thought this policy was established from statehood when we first had the state lands. It's just since 99. I guess I didn't realize that. That's good to know. Thank you.
and Mr. Chairman, you'll see that in the bill when you look at that. It basically calls out, if you go to page 2, and you go to line 7 and 8, it says acres of total trust land acreage held by the state on July 1st of 1999. So at that date, we had X, and what it does is to try to keep that plus or minus 10,000 acres from that date. So, Mr. Chairman, the next section that we go into in the bill is just under 1134-109 on page 3. That's the farm loan section that we currently have in statutes, and it just says that if somebody nominated 1 or 2 of these 80-acre parcels, they would be eligible to borrow through that farm loan program that SLIB currently authorizes. Typically, we would encourage people to go to the private sector, but they could access this program if they wanted to. Mr. Chairman, that's all that does. It says for these isolated 80s, they could utilize that process. And 36.1.101 on page 3 just brings in the definition of isolated parcel. It means a parcel of state trust lands or surrounded by non-state lands and without public access to the parcel. Mr. Chairman, then it just goes into existing statutes on page 4, which is 36.1.111. And then if you flip over, the only thing it does is when you get over to page 5, line 7 under Romanet I just says, including the disposal of any isolated parcels that is 80 acres or less. Again, we're just trying to target these scattered 2,000 and some parcels all over the state of Wyoming and consolidate those into larger parcels. Mr. Chairman, that's the bill.
Committee questions. Representative Conrad.
Chairman Nicholm, thank you. Just a quick question with your, Senator Hicks, with your two friends there. What do the critics say? I mean, what's the negative about this? It seems overwhelmingly positive, but again, not to assume, but what is the critical component of this that I guess we're maybe held accountable for?
I would say probably some of the potential concerns is, and the reason that we've not put a requirement that these have to be, it's kind of and you'll see that the one provision that I didn't talk about that I think gets to your question is the Office of State Land will send out a notice to every one of these leasees that these are eligible for sale. What we didn't want to do was force somebody to go out there and have to borrow money and then put them out of business. And so that's probably the single biggest concern, but it's not mandatory at this point in time. Initially, we had the concept to say by a certain date, you have to, if you're the leasee here, you have to either acquire or it's going to go up for public sale. And so that's probably at least the concerns I've heard is, and the reason we didn't make this a mandatory over the next 4 years, you have to acquire these, was we don't want to push somebody to the point where they have to go borrow money and end up in a situation where it puts them in a financial distress.
Representative Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in order to initiate this process, does one parcel need to be identified first that we want to purchase before we go in and put up one of the parcels for sale? So we have that no net gain or loss. Do we have that piece identified so we're not selling one parcel and then just going out and saying, well, I hope I find another one? Does that make sense?
Mr. Chairman, I think that I would turn that question over to Mr. Crowder. He's probably a little better to answer that question than that process and how that works.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Jason Crowder, Deputy Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. And maybe I'll start back in time a little bit and then get to your question, Representative Banks, if that's okay. So as Senator Hicks mentioned, we have been operating under this policy for quite some time. And back in 1997, the legislature passed statute, and it's in those session laws, that state trust land should remain a substantial component of the portfolio. And so since then, we have maintained that premise that land ownership and not just selling of the land needs to be a high priority. And we put that in front of the Board of Land Commissioners for every transaction it contemplates, to make sure that they know that that's the legislative intent for the management of the trust. And then in 2005, it did so further through a budget footnote saying the no net gain has to be something that you pay attention to. And it put in the 10,000 acres. And obviously a budget footnote only lasts as long as the budget is active. So that's since gone away. But as the Senator mentioned, we do operate under there, and it uses a base set of acreage that goes back to 1999. So we've maintained a database or a spreadsheet that knows exactly how much state land was owned back in 1999 within each county, how much was sold and how much was exchanged, and when that all occurred. Right now, we sit 3,300 acres below that baseline. And so it's important to note that through time, and this goes to your point a little bit, Representative Banks, that we've not ever exceeded the 10,000 acre cap. That as transactions come into the office, and we do it on a voluntary basis, as the Senator mentioned, they have naturally stayed within that baseline. We've not exceeded it. We've not gone above or below it, but as they come in, they normalize themselves. And it just so happens that currently we're 3,300 acres under that. But it does put a little bit of focus on transactions that come in, and maybe we prioritize a little bit differently. If we want to get back up to that baseline, we'll look at acquisitions or exchanges that have a positive acre benefit to the trust before we look at ones that have another negative acre benefit to the trust. So there's not a requirement that both sides of the transaction be fully identified when an application comes in. And sometimes that has to be vetted out or normalized through the appraisal process, because we have to do this on a value for value basis. And we don't know that until appraisals are done, and then we can adjust acreage at that point. So we don't fully need to know that. As the Senator also mentioned, this is voluntary, and it doesn't change anything the Constitution requires. So right now, if a parcel of state land is to be sold, it has to be sold at public auction per the constitutional requirements. That doesn't change. But what it does do is identify that these parcels need to be isolated, meaning that there's no public access to them, or there's not a lot of competition anyway that other bidders may come in. And there is no prohibition, I guess, on anybody else bidding on that when we get to the public auction, but they still have to get there if they were the successful bidder, and that's proven difficult over time. The Senator also mentioned that these are 80-acre parcels, and where he has inserted that is where we pull our trust land management objectives from. And we've talked about those objectives with this committee in this session already, but it just puts a higher sense of awareness on parcels that are 80 acres or less. It doesn't mean that though they fully displace all other transactions, but if we happen to have an 80-acre parcel, that we can weight that a little bit heavier inside of the trust land management objectives. And that's also complementary to rules that the board passed 2 years ago at the direction direction of the legislature as well, where we instituted what we call a voluntary land exchange program. And that uses the definition of isolated parcels as well, but it raises the bar to 640 acres or less. So this is largely complementary to that program. That program attempts to make those smaller transactions or exchanges that are wholly within somebody's land ownership pattern done in a quicker and less expensive manner. So we think that that this process, or the way the bill's written, is complementary to that. Mr. Chairman, the last thing I think that I would mention is that the notice piece is important. There's a lot of people who don't know that we have this program. Anybody can nominate any parcel of state land right now for a sale, exchange, or provide us a piece of private property for acquisition. Noticing them and letting them know that this is available, or that we will entertain an application if it were to come in, if it's beneficial to them, is important, because this is another way for us to benefit the revenue streams that come from these lands. When we have isolated parcels, we're pretty limited on what we can generate revenue from. It's largely just grazing. But if we were to work with the lessee who has one of these isolated parcels, able to get something that does have access, one, we're increasing public access, publicly accessible acres, but possibly increasing revenue streams or commercial development on those parcels as well, which would further benefit the state. Mr. Chairman, I am happy to answer any questions with that.
Committee questions? Yes, Representative Allemand.
I have a little concern. Is there, I know it's pretty much acre for acre, but what about the dollar amount? What concerns me is that you're going to trade a acre that costs 300 for an acre that costs 3,000. How's that worked out?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Rolleman, we're required through statute that it has to be a value for value basis, not an acre for acre basis. So that right there protects against that.
Other questions? Representative Craigo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this could be a question for any of the three of you, I guess. So as I read the bill, it has a cap going up, but it doesn't have a cap going down within the language of the bill. Do I read that correctly?
It's on the 10,000 acre cap or
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
expansion yet. Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. Representative Craigo, I think that's probably accurate. Now that I look at that, it doesn't set a floor on that. That floor would be the July 1st, 1999, but I don't think it specifically calls that out. It just says you can't go above that. So again, I would say, ask Mr. Crowder, I believe the policy is that not to go below 10,000, and we may want to include that in there as an amendment.
You'd be good with that if we amended it that way. Okay, Representative Craigo.
Different question, Mr. Chairman, and this is probably for Mr. Crowder. So if we have a 80 acre up on the mountain in the middle of some ranch in a beautiful spot, I mean, under current policy, anybody can nominate that piece for sale. Does this particular piece of legislation change that, make it worse? I guess what I'm worried about is you're gonna have ranchers having to go compete at market rate for land that's historically always just been ag, right? And now somebody wants to go put a $5 million cabin on an 80 acre parcel up in the middle of the Bighorn Mountains, thinking about myself maybe.
Your neighbor won't like that.
That's right. And so I guess my question is are we protecting ag with this particular bill, or are we harming ag with this particular bill?
Mr. Chairman, I'll take the first stab at that. I don't think we're doing either, because the only ones that would you can do that already under existing statutes, right? I can nominate your 80 acre, 40 acre parcel in the middle of your ranch, so that doesn't change. All this does is send the notice out to the leasee that says you may want to consider this. So we're trying to urge those leasees to take care of this issue and nominate those lands. Now, again, once those lands are nominated, it would be go to a public auction, but we wanted to provide an opportunity for those leasees to drive the process and say, look, I'm interested in buying that 40 acres from the state of land that's all landlocked in the middle of my ranch. So that's the way I anticipate it would work. It's really not going to be out there that we're saying anybody in the public should go out and nominate. The notice will only go to those leasees.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could add on to that. There's not a requirement for the lessee to actually buy the parcels within, but there's also not a requirement that the Board of Land Commissioners has to approve the application that comes in either. So I don't know if that's a protection of grazing, but it's a protection of the trust to ensure that the parcels retained have a beneficial component to increasing the value of the trust. And really what this, at the end of the day, as the senator mentioned, there's not a lot of change, just a heightened awareness. The only real change is that there's another financing mechanism here that's available that wasn't available before.
Representative Craigo.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. So I guess what I'm concerned about is that we're sending a message that this is already in the law. You can already do this. And I feel we're sending a message as the legislature, we want you state lands to start selling these lands. We want you to start, in essence, marketing these 80 acres. And so once they go up for bid, even if the bid or the application comes from the lessee and you approve that application, it's public auction. So once it goes up, anybody can sneak in there and buy the property. It's not limited to the landowner. They don't have a right of first refusal. They don't have any preference at that point. Is that correct? And it's two questions, and I'm sorry, it's sort of compound. A, are we sending a policy message, A? And B, is there any real protection for the surrounding rancher at that point?
Mr. Chairman, I think the answer to the question is this follows existing process already. So there's no more or no less protections than currently exist in law. You know, again, what we're trying to do here is basically derive more income for the trust. The fiduciary responsibility of the trust lands is not necessarily to protect one industry over another. I mean, certainly we want to facilitate that. I think that's why we're here before the Ag Committee, is to try to do a no harm provision in here. I don't know, under the constitutional provisions that we have with the fiduciary responsibility to drive the highest rate of returns we can, how we would go out there and say, well, you get last right of refusal. I know that's been a discussion for a long, long time, and you have to navigate that constitutional provision that state assets have to be done in a public auction. So I don't know how we can ever provide 100% guarantee for those ag producers. Again, this is just to say, hey, maybe you ought to think about this. It doesn't require anybody to do anything. And Mr. Chairman and Representative Craigo, you know the difficulty of having to go through a process of ingress to an isolated parcel and a contested case, and can drag out for a long time. And certainly this is not the intent, is to create those problems. But at the end of the day, we have that other fiduciary responsibility, and that's what we're trying to balance here. If you can figure out a better way to do it, I'm all ears. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
I guess I'd have a question while we're on this, and I'll get to you in a minute. We got one down here too. The first right of refusal to the leasee would not be in this. So, is there any way we could fit it into it in an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I know over my years of working on state lands issue, that's always been something that we've sought, but it starts to run afoul of the constitutional provision of disposable state lands. Have to be, any state asset, whether it's a building or state lands, has to be done at a public auction.
Okay.
So if you want to amend the Constitution, Mr. Chairman, I'd certainly support that for this purpose, but that's a pretty long road to hoe.
We're always wanting to do that when we don't like it.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Conrad and all. Oh, yes, let's go to Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think,
I'll get you.
you know, the good country lawyer does make a valid point, but I think it's also to keep in mind, this is just for 80 acres or less. not to say 80 acres is insignificant, because 80 acres is 80 acres, but we're putting that cap in there because I think the type of scenario that Representative Craig was mentioning is much more likely when we're dealing with these larger tracts of land that are, several hundreds or thousands of acres, which we do see through other venues, through some of these applications, these land applications for these exchanges that we see throughout the state. I think those are the ones that can draw serious attention from a lot of different people from across the economic spectrum who are just these ranches that are trying to get by versus some of these folks with a lot of money that are coming in. So I think that 80-acre cap is a mechanism to avoid or dissuade that type of scenario where you do have someone coming in where it's hundreds or thousands of acres that are up for grabs. So I just ask the committee to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Representative Conrad.
Chairman Lincoln, thank you. My question does not involve the Constitution or the changing thereof. My question really surrounds when it regards to these 80-acre parcels. Does that include or exclude, or can you divide them out as it relates to surface rights and or mineral rights within those areas? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman. Representative Conrad, I think I can answer that. We have a statute, and the exact one is eluding me right now, but we have to retain all mineral rights in a transaction unless we can do a value for value exchange of those minerals as well.
So with that being said, the follow-up question is specifically Director Crowder, this specifically, if I understood your answer, is only surface rights in these parcels. So the mineral rights would be maintained or retained by the state. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, that's correct, unless we can exchange something that we have a known value of those minerals, and that's hard to do. So you're correct.
Thank you.
Representative Banks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. From my own understanding of the process here, I just have a question about, so let's say going back to the previous question by Representative Crago, say he's got a piece of 80 acres up in the Bighorn surrounded by his own private land, has been grazing it. Somebody nominates that piece for this program. When it goes down to the Office of State Lands, do they take a look and say, well, he's been grazing this piece, it's been in use, we're not gonna put it up for auction? Or is it, how does that process, is there a process of it's been in use for 20 years, we're not gonna put it up for auction? Does that take a precedence? Does that hold any weight in the decision? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Banks, as we discussed before, we measure all of these transactions against the trust land management objectives. And so the first part of that objective is how does the land value increase or decrease based on the transaction, and how does the revenue from that land increase or decrease based on the transaction? That revenue can bring in the grazing annual revenue that parcel currently exhibits, and what if we sold that parcel and invested those funds? What are the expected investment revenues to come in? So we're going to weigh it in that manner. But it's also important to note that part of the regular process, exchange or sale or acquisition, has a public component to it. We have to notice a public comment period for 60 days. And in those 60 days, anybody who has an issue like the one you're raising, we've used it forever and we have a third party coming in, can raise that issue and we'll present it to the board and they can make a decision based on it. And we'll have a public hearing where they can do that in person, live, and verbally as well. So it's important to note that the board takes that kind of situation seriously. It'll look at the trust land management objectives, but if it does have a serious impact to grazing operations, and that may have as much benefit to the trust as possible earnings that come off that parcel, they could deny the transaction. It's also important to note in the regular process and in this bill, the majority of the time it's the surrounding landowner that will propose this type of a transaction. But you're right, anybody can do it at any time. But that person is on notice that it's occurring. If it is a direct sale and if the board agrees to move forward after all the public process has gone through, he will be at the auction as well to participate.
But that could happen now without the passage of this bill. Representative Davis.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, going back to Representative Conrad's question about the sub-minerals and the surface minerals. You know, in certain areas, a gravel pit is extremely sought after, you know, and if one of these parcels was nominated, how would you, you know, and that person, depending on who that would be, could sublease that gravel out for a substantial amount of, is my question on that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, and it's a good question. As we talked about before, we develop what we call a detailed analysis that talks about every aspect of the parcel, including mineral development. We believe the sand and gravel, you're asking me to go back and think about something I haven't thought about for many years, is the subsurface estate or the surface estate, and it generates revenue back to the trust. So however that revenue stream currently comes into the trust, or if it's a private parcel, how it could come into the trust, that will be a part of the detailed analysis and the revenue stream that the board will consider when it makes its decision.
And just to add to that, I think when there's a split estate, the gravel is considered part of the surface, is my understanding as well. Representative Alleman.
Mr. Chairman, how much is this detailed analysis costing? Do we look at, you know, you said you're looking at minerals and all sorts of things. Is this a very expensive analysis? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Alleman, it really depends on the transaction. We charge, or the board has put in its rules, a required application fee of $1,000. And roughly that covers all of our expenses to develop that detailed analysis. But if we need to go into more depth, we also enter into an agreement, a buy-sell agreement. We call it an agreement to initiate the exchange. And if there needs to be more expense or more studies done, then we put that off on the applicant and not on the office.
Representative Craigle. Conrad, you've even got your sign turned. And I can't use first names because there are 3 Johns on the committee, so my apologies, Representative Freshman, Representative.
Chairman Eklund, follow-up question to Representative Allman's. Would that include or exclude a NEPA? If a NEPA is required, would that go to the respective new prospective buyer?
Mr. Chairman, the state of Wyoming isn't required to comply with federal National Environmental Policy Act laws.
Finished with questions. Anything to add? Sponsors or deputy? Thank you. I think we're ready for public comment. Mr. McGagna. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGaggan with the Wyoming Stockholders Association, also representing the Wyoming Wool Growers Association today. I start from the premise that this legislation doesn't really change anything that can already be done today, as we understand it. All of those processes are in place. And so what we see this as doing is putting an emphasis, the legislature giving some direction to the Board of Land Commissioners that we want to focus on disposing of these isolated parcels of 80 acres or less. And certainly we don't disagree with that objective. We do have some serious concern with the legislation as drafted, and Representative Craigle has expressed pretty much what I'm intending to express. As we look at this, anyone can nominate. There's no preference or no first opportunity given to the surrounding landowner to nominate the land, which I think could be done without any constitutional objection. Clearly, the land, if it's sold, has to be sold to the highest bidder, and we don't dispute that. But as opposed to just notifying grazing lessees, perhaps a time period during which they could submit an offer if they chose to do so before it's open to others would be one option. Another option would be, just as we do on leasing of state lands, there's a preference for an adjacent landowner to meet the high bid if there's a competing bid and lease the land. I don't see it would be any different if we provided that preference in this legislation if we go forward to meet the high bid. So that's my concern. There is that someone else comes in, and it could be someone like Representative Craigo who wants to build a nice home on the mountain. It could be a disgruntled neighbor who says, boy, I'd love to own 80 acres in the middle of his ranch, and give him a bad time. Could be a lot of things could happen there. And that I think this doesn't provide any protection for. And frankly, because of the requirement, which we respect, it's constitutional, of selling land to the highest bidder, our advice for many, many years to grazing lessees who approach us and say, what do you think if we were to acquire this parcel of land, has been, if at all possible, do it through an exchange, because an exchange can be a private transaction, value for value. If you propose a purchase, value goes out the window. It's whatever someone is willing to pay for it, which might be multiple times what the value of that parcel of land is. So that's why, frankly, more of these lands aren't being purchased today, because landowners are reluctant to propose an outright purchase, knowing that they're then put up against competitive bidders for any potential use of the land, not just for grazing use of the land. So for those reasons, Mr. Chairman, one, we don't think that the legislation is necessary because this can all happen already today. And two, we're concerned that by putting a focus on disposing of these parcels, which certainly would make sense from a state land perspective, but that we're putting current lessees or landowners who surround these lands at a higher risk than they already are of someone else acquiring the land. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to entertain any questions. I would point out one other item, Mr. Chairman, that I note that it says land surrounded by non-state lands. So I assume this would also apply to 80 acre or less sections that are located in the middle of federal lands, and whether that's the intent or not, but that's the way it would appear. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Questions, committee? Okay, I might ask the sponsor if he can answer that question. 80 acres surrounded by other lands.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, if you go to the definition of isolated parcel, we bring in without public access. So if it's a 40 acre section or an 80 acre and it's in the middle of BLM, that's not an emphasis under the definition. It has to be without public access. So I hope that answers that question, Mr. Chairman. So it's really targeted to those that are isolated in holdings.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you, Mr. McGagna. Any other public testimony? No one online? Okay, committee, what's your pleasure? Moved by Conrad. Second? We have a second on the bill? Second. Seconded by Davis. Discussion on the bill. Representative Allemand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think this bill's ready for us yet. It changes nothing. And it needs to have first right of refusal in it somewhere. I think this bill needs to go back and be redone. Thank you.
I'm pretty sure, yeah, I'm not discussing. I'm pretty sure we can't do the first right of refusal. That it's just gonna go to the highest bidder is what constitutionally we'll have to do one way or another. Representative
Mr.
Allemand.
Chairman, if it goes to auction and the highest bidder, okay, we could put in there right of refusal plus $1, and then that is the highest bidder. Is that not possible? I don't know how that would work legally.
Deputy, could you come up and maybe just educate us on that process?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a good question. The thing is, what we feel, and when we were working with the grazing fee and the preference applied in that scenario, if there's always going to be an opportunity for another individual or an opportunity for the lessee to match the highest bid of another individual, does the other individual stop bidding or just to not even participate anymore, which depresses the market and maybe not get to the full value of that parcel? That's the concern we've had with that over time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there any way that we can protect the rancher a little more than just throwing this out on the free market? And is there any way?
And Mr. Chairman, Representative Alman, I think I'd just go back to the comments I made before, that they're heavily involved in the process, and the Board of Land Commissioners really considers their comments seriously. So if they're concerned that somebody else may come in at the auction and outbid them, they have the opportunity to express that concern to the board and try to entice the board not to move forward with sale. And that's probably the best opportunity they have. But absolutely, they're on equal footing with anybody else who would come to that sale also.
Committee, other questions? Representative Davis. Okay.
I think, Mr. Chair, this bill does, as was pointed out earlier, give the ability to go to multiple lending institutions in order to come up with a matching value, you know, and I think that's a great deal in there. You know, gives them the ability to finance this land. I think that's a positive out of this.
Representative Winter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I'm not mistaken, it's been said here a couple of times that this bill is not going to make any changes. And so my concern is that why are we even talking about it? Maybe we need to just kill the bill and utilize what we have. If there's something I'm missing here, why, please let me know.
So if I can answer that question, the fundamental difference is right now, while the process doesn't change than what we currently have, what it does do is afford anybody that nominates those 80-acre parcels an opportunity to work through the state of Wyoming through two different loan packages that they have, either through farm loans, which has never been available for the acquisition of state lands. And then there's another provision that's existing in statutes that will be included in that notice. So the fundamental difference is it calls out those 8 isolated 80-acre parcels, which is right now, it's any state parcel. This just says this is an emphasis, doesn't mean you have to. But the big difference is it provides loan opportunities through the farm loan, which I believe right now are around 3.5 or 4%, which is probably below what the industry standard is today. So that's the big change, is it says we do provide that loan package available for anybody that would want to exercise their right to nominate a piece of state land. Again, we don't want to put an undue financial burden on anybody that would want to utilize this tool.
Committee, other questions? Okay. Oh, we got one. Representative Schlegel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess one question, looking at the bill, it was mentioned earlier that talks about a net increase, and there was a comment that we should probably have in there net loss as well in that paragraph.
We think we might have a solution.
You got that, thank you.
amendment.
Okay,
Yeah.
good, thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Okay. So we'll open it. Have we moved the bill?
Yes.
Been moved and seconded. All right. I'd open it to discussion, and one amendment that I think would work into the bill would be on page 2. And that pertains to the 10,000 acre. Okay. So line 6, after increase, we'd insert or decrease. And then line 7, after above, we would insert or below. I think that would do what we want that portion to do. You follow that, sponsors?
Mr. Chairman, I think you'd want to strike some of that language. You still have decrease of trust lands greater than 10,000 in there, so. What I think that you would, let me propose this for consideration, would be on line 6, just as you stated, Mr. Chairman, after increase, insert the word or decrease of stays in there, and then insert 10,000 acres of, leave trust lands, and then after that, strike greater than 10,000 acres above the total trust land acres. So you would strike that language, so now we're received, shall result in a net increase or decrease of state trust lands, or excuse me, let me start over again. Shall result in a net increase or decrease of 10,000 acres of trust lands held by the state on July 1st, 1999.
So Mark, do you have that? Maybe read it back so the
Okay,
committee's
so
clear on this
Mr.
before
Chairman,
we
so
vote.
starting on line 6, it will say increase, and then insert or decrease of, insert 10,000 acres of trust, so you'll insert 10,000 acres of trust lands, and then you're gonna strike greater than 10,000 acres in line 6. On line 7, you're gonna just strike acres above the total trust land acres and leave the balance of the line on 7 and 8. So that will now read, starting at, I'm gonna start on line 5, that no acquisition or exchange shall result in a net increase or decrease of 10,000 acres of trust lands held by the state on July 1st, 1999.
Is the committee clear on what we've amended? All right, so did, yeah, okay. I think it was moved. Anyway, I moved it, seconded by Davis. The committee ready to vote on the amendment? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Amendment passes. Any other changes to the bill? Any other discussion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I do think that Mr. McGagnon brought up an important point, and I do think that Representative Alleman, we probably need to go back and see if we can't find some language. I'm sure my co-sponsor will work with the stock growers in the Office of State Lands to bring in that concept of at least being able to have preferential right to match the highest bid. And so if the committee was so inclined, Mr. Chairman, I'd be willing to try to work on a committee of the whole amendment with the Representative Western to see if we can find something on that, if the committee was inclined to send this bill on.
Okay, Representative Alleman. I'll get you in a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would agree with that. I mean, we do it for people that are leasing it. And so why couldn't we do it selling it? I mean, because you could bid up to what you thought was your highest bid, and if they bid one higher, you would have the opportunity to match that bid being the current lessee. So, I mean, I think language like that would be good.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so if the committee was willing to advance it, we would certainly work with the stock growers in the Office of State Lands and Investment to try to bring that concept into a committee of the whole amendment. And if we can't, then I would suggest we lay the bill back until we can figure out how to do that.
Okay, Representative Alderman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I think we can protect ranchers if we go back and research and do a little more. I don't think this bill does it. I think this bill actually hurts ranchers with the availability of money because or loans. It's not just to the ranchers, it's to everybody. Thank you.
Any further? Okay, sensing we're ready to vote. Roll call.
Representative Allemand,
No.
Representative Allred.
Aye.
Representative Banks,
No.
Representative Conrad,
Aye.
Representative Craigo,
He's excused. I'm gonna hold the vote open for him though.
Representative Davis,
Aye.
Representative Slagle,
Aye.
Representative Winter,
No.
Chairman Eklund.
Aye. It won't matter if we hold the vote open, I don't think.
5
so.
ayes, 3 noes.
All right.
Bill passed with amendments.
All right, and we'll work on another committee of the whole amendment here in the meantime.
Distribute that to the committee prior to running anything out of the committee of the whole amendment. Would like to get the input of the committee back on that before it hits the House floor.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
So, committee, you've had a taste of the complexities of some of these simple ag bills we come up with. The meeting is adjourned. Good work.
Thank you.